We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
This is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
All right, it's Friday, September 29th, 2023, and Jeremy, rest in peace, Dianne Feinstein, 90 years old.
She, I guess she had been, having these major health issues for a long time and had been resisting, like almost in denial in terms of even her staff for a while. And so I guess she finally let go. And there's a lot of her background, obviously it's not all horrific, but a lot of it's pretty bad in terms of, many people don't know this, but there's this whole California corruption element to the background of Dianne Feinstein and her husband. I forget, Richard Bloom. I think Richard Bloom, that people can fact check me on that. But there's a bunch of it looks like public corruption in terms of the promises of high-speed trains being built in California and the seizing of certain lands or the investment in certain lands, that nothing ever really gets done, where there is major questions around even this California economics and political corruption background of Feinstein and her husband. And then you move into the national levels, and she was a crucial player ultimately in the allowing the Iraq war deception to be pushed, and then casting her vote for it. And she did some bit of good work in terms of the question of torture in the Senate, and seemed to hold some space for getting some documentation looked at and out there. But in general, it does seem like we are at a very strange place in terms of the insistence of this really, increasingly decrepit older guard who are unwilling to release the reins of power. It does really seem that this should have been the real logical and principled move here would have been for her to step down because of health issues a while ago, and then for Newsom to probably designate the real, if there's a single courageous Congress person from the post 9/11 era when a vote really mattered, not in largely symbolic way, it's Barbara Lee. And she seems to be she would be the legitimate inheritor of that California Senate position, I would think. So we'll see what happens now in terms of what Gavin Newsom decides to do.
Both Bay Area representatives, right?
Yes, right. So
San Francisco, Barbara Lee, Oakland, right?
Exactly. Oh, it's almost like a Bay, a Bay Bridge, Bay Area, political banging in some way, because it is the case. Yeah, Feinstein comes up through San Francisco politics, and there's a lot of I think she was she mayor of San Francisco, and she was around in the days of even, I think, of the Harvey Milk assassination and all very strange stuff, way in those earlier days of California politics. But yeah, you're right. Barbara Lee is Oakland, and Feinstein hails from San Francisco.
Right. So let's get Gavin Newsom. Go ahead and give that seat to Barbara Lee, especially if you're considering between her and Adam Schiff. I'd say Katie Porter as well, but especially, if you've got to choose between Adam Schiff and Barbara Lee, please go with, go with Barbara Lee. But I don't have my fingers crossed necessarily on that, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, 90 years old, and we were talking a little bit just to wrap up on this topic here, because we'll let other people really dissect the legacy of Dianne Feinstein. There will be a lot of people to do that, but. We were talking last night. We had we had a few of our patrons together for a space, and we were talking amongst ourselves about you mentioned decrepitness of this elder statesman, so to speak, of the Senate, and Mitch McConnell, the shape he's in, all the health problems we're having. We were talking about as bad of this era of politics has been. This is I had always thought that the 2016 with the Bushes and the Clintons and the symbolicness of Trump and their dynasties, and then obviously now Joe Biden and the presidency. This is I've seen this as maybe the last of this bygone era of what is becoming a bygone era of politics, where it's not just especially I guess in terms of the Republicans, where you'll have these and maybe in the case of Dianne Feinstein as well, I don't think it's quite the same, but these. Mitch McConnell is known as a grave digger in democracy and did all this with the judicial system and the courts and all these various agendas, but still compared to what is coming up, it was this last of the bygone of the bipartisan, I guess, respectful politics of the older era, which was corrupt as hell, but also was between that and where we're headed now with all this destabilization and just the state of politics as we're moving into. It's these Feinsteins and McConnells and maybe even a Mitt Romney who just retired, they represent what I see as kind of a dying bygone, what is becoming a bygone era of what things once were. Then you're just moving into what's to come, especially with the Republican side. But then also, you got the flip of that with Feinstein. You can have some young, there's potentially some younger blood that could move in a positive direction away from that. But then again, also, you got to imagine that there's more Hakeem Jeffries waiting in the wings, so to speak. So it can go both ways on that. But I hope that this point I'm making here makes sense about this bygone era of corrupt but respectable politics is really coming to an end, I think, in a way of the way it was done in the past, so to speak. The way we've understood business as usual politics is becoming a thing in the past, and I think you see the Feinsteins and the McConnells is maybe an example of that.
Definitely, and it's almost the clutching onto power as they sort of disintegrate in front of the cameras to some extent. And I'm not ageist in the way that there's a lot of 90-year-olds who are really with it and wise and bring a lot to the table in terms of public life. In many ways, they bring the most to the table, especially those that have really matured and let their life experience inform their understanding of the world, and some of them have minds that are very, very powerful. And so I'm not inherently against the idea of having some built-in institutional memory. It makes a lot of sense I think to have some continuity in relationship to our structures, and especially government structures. Are the people who have seen a lot happen there and really know the workings really, really well. But people like Mitch McConnell and Dianne Feinstein, I would say, especially, in terms of, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, really represent a major conundrum, a blocking point right now in terms of the potential opening of a window for fresh voices, fresh thought to come in there. And other people will argue, well, where are the new leaders? And the new leaders are beginning to emerge. There needs to be some space made for them. And we would hope that there would be some institutional memory that would then be shared with the incoming generations and fresher potential leadership. And of course, we still have what I would consider maybe our most core political conundrum in terms of both elections and governing, which is the fact that we still have a government under control of a two-party RICO operation, which is why some of the wiser considerations of the framing generation were very wary of even a party system in general. And I agree with that. And now I don't think we can outlaw parties because it's probably both wrong to do so, and it's also probably unconstitutional in terms of the First Amendment, in terms of right to assemble and association and all of that. But in terms of political custom and an ethos, a public ethos, I think it really begins to make sense for us to begin to stand on our own 2 feet in terms of our political associations. Now, what I think that will do is it will force people to actually you do politics based from first principles and based on commonality of principles, and then use differences, real differences, political considerations of policy and of differences in principle toward what is meant to be the best of politics, which I think is actually synergistic intelligence, real assembled intelligence, where difference doesn't turn into quote unquote compromise, which implies someone's being compromised, I would say, at some level, but it actually ends up in a cooperative synergy where the whole is actually greater than the parts, rather than just sort of the split the difference between the parts. And so I think if we can begin to make the case for a public politics and a governance philosophy of where people stand on their own independently, then the actual proper alliances and an ability to create cooperative and organically arising groups of different political sensibilities will come about. So I think that there's those two things are I would say are highlighted in the figures of the Mitch McConnell, the freezing Mitch McConnell, and then the clutching rest in clutching power Dianne Feinstein types of this moment. And by the way, Greg, one last thing is the book I was thinking of for anyone who's interested in the deep political background of California, big money and political corruption that includes a lot from Feinstein and her husband, whose name is Richard Bloom, is a book called Paradise Lost? ? High-speed trains get waylaid, shady politicians get billions, and taxpayers get the shaft, by Richard Trainer, a memoir of political corruption and public apathy. And Trainer is spelled Trainor. A very, very interesting book by a guy who has a deep background as a journalist. I think he came up through Sacramento newspapers, and which is where the state capital of California is. And so he knows the ins and outs. So there's a lot about Willie Brown in here. So anyone who's interested in where Kamala Harris, the networks of power that Kamala Harris comes up through, I might want to look into this too.
All right. Well, thank you for that recommendation, Jeremy. And we'll leave, I guess, the conversation on Feinstein and the decrepitness. I'm not sure if that's a term or not, but of the declining, I guess, faculties of some of our elder holders on to of some type of bygone era of politics to other people, and we'll come back to that another day maybe. But I guess we want to get into the top. We just watched this space yesterday on X, formerly Twitter, of Ben Shapiro hosting with Elon Musk, or Elon Musk, as Benjamin Netanyahu called him, and what you referred to as the neo Parushim of Jewish, religious leaders, societal figures like Alan Dershowitz, and we want to get into that shortly. But I guess before we do that, I want to just talk about a couple of things that we are going to circle back to from our last program where we started into this topic of the doppelgangers of Naomi Klein and Naomi Wolf, and some of the things that we were identifying with that, and we're going to be returning to that, but just a little bit of like a preview or a quick look ahead at what's going to be coming with that, because we're going to be getting into some very interesting territories, even relates to the heart of the Jeffrey Epstein network around the ostracizing of Naomi Wolf from quote unquote respectable liberal, whatever term you want to use, intellectual society.
Yes, and this we pointed out this was a crucial moment where Douglas Rushkoff is interviewing Naomi Klein about her new book on her doppelganger mirror world adventures, focused around Naomi Wolf and her move from a liberal feminist Democrat through to how she ends up in the war room with Steve Bannon, and especially sort of amplified, not triggered, because Naomi Wolf, this is a much longer kind of evolution in certain ways, devolution in others over the years, but that was catalyzed or amplified or amphetamine in terms of the 3/11 operation and the COVID operation, where she then gets what they would call quote unquote radicalized. And I'm still unwilling to give up that word, no matter how many times people abuse it. I will continue to claim to be of the lineage of political radicals, meaning getting to the root, rooting out corruption, criminality, that kind of thing, and then also pursuing this idea of the middle, the radical middle, meaning where are the roots starting from of a tree? They're starting from that middle, and then they expand outward. So, but Naomi Wolf's journey here as a Naomi Klein then reflects upon as a digital reflection of her, and where there's actually phantoms and misassociations and maybe some disassociations in relationship to her Naomi Klein's personal experience, where she's at Occupy Wall Street, and women from the left are wrongly confusing her with a recent article by Naomi Wolf. And Naomi Klein comes out of the stall and is like, no, that was not Naomi Klein. I'm Naomi Klein. That was Naomi Wolf claiming to speak for the demands of the Occupy movement. And we notice that part of what's going on here, and this is even way beyond even this Klein conversation, is really not only an obfuscation of deep politics, but really almost like the weaponization of deep politics, and also for sure the weaponization of the obfuscation of deep politics. And we're seeing this a lot with the Jewish left, I think, in where we're looking right now in terms of this conversation of Rushkoff and Klein. They skip over this moment where Rushkoff talks about this incident that you pointed out, Greg, where Wolf and Rushkoff are in a room in a salon. It sounds like a sort of a civil society salon hosted by John Brockman, who I think Rushkoff labels as a literary agent. And so we then go looking at that as a key thing. They don't mention Epstein. And Rushkoff obviously knows about John Brockman, Edge, not only as a publisher, but the Edge conferences, which are the crucial connector and were largely funded by Jeffrey Epstein for years on end that tied the John Brockman New York and academic and scientific literati, literally, like they're the big book writers, let's say, for certain ideas or popular science or academic, frameworks that are then presented to the larger public directly to Silicon Valley, especially during a time where there's the rise of what are now like the biggest companies, not only in the country, but in the world in many ways, right? Where you have the Jeff Bezoses and the Sergey Brins and Larry Pages and the Elon Musks in the kinds of circles with John Brockman's literati salon types, and a lot of it's being backed by Epstein for, at the very least, access. And now that, I think, is the limited explanation for why Epstein is doing this. Sure, it's access, and he wants to invest in them and really ultimately compromise them via money. But you can even see in terms of leaked emails that Brockman seemed to actually be playing a Ghislaine Maxwell role in relationship between some of his quote unquote authors and Epstein, when Epstein would come into town and Brockman would, try to hook them up around things like talking about how Epstein always comes with these young girls or young Russian models, or you may be interested to meet him. He's also has all this money and all that. And Rushkoff it looks like there's maybe only 3 published authors or people who had Brockman as their literary agent who publicly disassociated themselves from Brockman after the Epstein operation became a public scandal. And one of them is Rushkoff. So Rushkoff, that's a good thing here, right? Obviously, he's one of these few people who's actually took that seriously and disassociated himself publicly. Naomi Wolf was another one who disassociated herself publicly from having been, I guess she was represented. That was her literary agent in the 90s when she came up on the scene about the what was it? The
Beauty myth.
The beauty myth. Thank you, Greg. Yeah. And that's how she sort of hits the public intellectual scene and then moves in as a political consultant into the Clinton White House, and then is advising Al Gore for his run for president in terms of image and communications and all of that. And so you have to then go back to, Naomi Wolf's origins as a public intellectual are via this John Brockman, Edge, Epstein, Maxwell network. And Wolf, disassociates herself from it. And then there's a third author who also then publicly disassociates himself with it. And he's the one actually who seems to have leaked the emails after he was, wondering when Brockman was going to make a public comment, and Brockman at least acknowledging the criminality of Epstein and his relationship, and Brockman never did. So we notice that there was this skipping over this really crucial moment between Rushkoff and Klein, where Rushkoff is attempting to explain Wolf being, in their version, quote unquote, radicalized maybe from the civil liberal literati toward the radical right or something like that, because her sense of a spiritual element to reality over just pure materialism was being ridiculed by one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism, actually Richard Dawkins in that case. And so Epstein's name's never brought up. It would have been an opportune moment to dip into some deep political analysis, and yet it's all glossed over. And so that's just an indicator and a larger, I think, a symbol of a larger problem of what's actually going on with this Naomi Klein book and new push to expose the dangers of conspiracy theories, and especially ultimately quote unquote anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which he said which is where it all heads.
Absolutely, and of course Dawkins is along with his fellow atheist horseman. Sam Harris has been published by Edge quite a bit over the years, and so you picked up on the significance of Brockman, and I was able to look at here that Dawkins' name was in there as part of this what scientific elite intelligentsia who's just ridiculing Naomi Wolf and her ideas and are ostracizing her and just giving her a hard time, I guess, and that's what it sounded like. And we're gonna come back to this because I think this is important when we do come back to this. This is an important part of, I think, the ostracizing and the marginalizing of a figure like Naomi Wolf from this group of these Epstein connected scientific. There's terms for these people. Maybe use the term technocrats of these of this elite that were into these adjacent types of I think ideas and promotion of that people talked about in terms of Epstein and certain elements of scientific quote unquote advancement, quote unquote human advancement, and all of this that figures into, I think, the rejection of an idea around alternative or differing ideas on things like medicine and on things like diseases, etc. That then leads you into an area like Steve Bannon's war room. And of course, Steve Bannon has his own unanswered questions about Epstein, of course, and so it leads you into it sounds to me like this is another type of a horseshoe where you find a receptive audience for the ideas that are perhaps getting you rejected by these elitists within these particular circles around John Brockman, and then lead you into another direction, which is ultimately, on one hand, is using the information to weaponize it and as part of this bigger project to, as Steve Bannon says, destroy the administrative state and just seems just throw as much shit on the wall as possible, in his words, to foment as much chaos and division, stoking flames of various things for various agendas, but then also lead you into another network that is likely to lead you back to the same or very similar element with the same figures like the Epsteins of the world. So it's very interesting, but this needs to be focused on more, and we're going to do that, Jeremy. And then also we're going to focus on a bit on this is a little bit supplemental to this conversation on the ADL because it figures into it. Naomi Wolf then moving into, with her, she's been critical of Israel, Palestine in recent years, as you mentioned, I think before, even dabbled her foot into what might be called 9/11 truth, but then just kind of got out of the waters pretty quickly, I guess, and went into a more Israel-Palestine direction. Is that an accurate way of putting things?
That's a sort of it. I mean, it seemed like it was all part of a certain kind of intellectual evolution that she was on. She during the Bush years, she began to really grow concerned about the threats to basic liberty and growing indications of fascist type of movements and governmental architecture in terms of the surveillance state and the uprising of potential criminalization of core political rights. And so she began to write in that direction, and then she began to have some interface with 9/11 Truth, and around that same time, I think she was also getting educated on the power of the Israel lobby and began to talk about that. But it is the case that she never really dealt with 9/11 treason, as I directly, requested that she do some investigation into, as both a touchstone for understanding the kinds of events that are able to really catalyze a push towards authoritarianism and a war state and police states and all of that, while also being a crucial piece to, again, radically rooting out these kinds of elements under even our own constitutional law in terms of Article 3, Section 3 treason in relationship to that. And to me, she sort of poo-pooed it a little bit. She said I was going on too long and they needed to get on to other questions. But she said, yes, I am concerned about this. I will talk to my lawyer friends about this, and we never really heard much from her in terms of an actual factual analysis of September 11th, who did it and why.
Okay. Well, thank you for filling that in. But she goes from this looking at this whole thing of like Israel lobbying in a direction of the Palestinians as the as the oppressed and the victims and the in this whole thing over with Israel Palestine, but then ultimately moves in direction with Steve Bannon, a guy who both could credibly be called like what would pass for a certain interpretation of what we would call anti-Semitism with his with his attitudes about what was comments that were projected to him about his kids going to school with with Jews, and then also even like the whole dynamic of like the the elite, Catholic, Georgetown, Goldman Sachs, Naval Intelligence, Seinfeld, and all the dynamics of these dynamics of quote unquote conservative populist leaders. In this case, of Bannon has seems to harbor some resentment in a way that we've talked about, even like right wing Zionist Jews harboring towards liberal Jews and liberalism in general, and then also heading and being really the brains and the spearheader behind Breitbart, the operation made in America, conceived in Israel, that you've labeled as the Death Star of 2016, and the rise of Brexit and the rise of Trump being so important to these geopolitical shifts in terms of that have taken place in the U.S. and in Western Europe, and also globally with other figures as well. And so we'll talk more about this whole thing with Naomi Wolf moving into a direction like this, and also it seems once she gets like into this Bannon orbit, then like just becomes it doesn't just become about like her issues with COVID vaccines and COVID lockdowns and issues with how COVID's being handled, but then it also becomes Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, is a victim of the deep state, and based on her retweets, and so you move into like then it just becomes like this where I find a receptive audience in one area. Well, look at all these other areas that they're right on. I mean, that was kind of my impression. So we'll talk more about these when we go forward with this conversation on the doppelgangers and Wolf and Klein, because I think that these are important. These are important areas to really dig in and put a good amount of focus on, because I think they're instructive for some of the bigger conversations we're going to have going forward.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize a point that you made that we will then return to when we return directly to this Klein-Wolf conversation, is that you pointed out what really is should be seen as these deep political, in this case, Epstein-Maxwell sexual, political, criminal compromise operation bookends of Naomi Wolf's career as it has come to currently, where you have the John Brockman 90s Epstein production of her early literary career as her literary agent, and then she ends up as sort of like the Roger Stone or some the Owen Schroyer type to Steve Bannon in many ways. And as you pointed out, Greg, Steve Bannon knew that Epstein was the Achilles heel of Donald Trump, and then even got into the room with Epstein. It appears Ehud Barak was around at the time when Bannon was getting into the room with Epstein during the Trump years to see if he could coach Epstein to be a public relations advisor, basically do for Epstein what Naomi Wolf was doing for Al Gore to some extent. And so Naomi Wolf's, whatever the slide from left to right, it's all bookended by Epstein operatives. And so that also is a key missing piece, obviously, of the Rushkoff-Klein analysis, I think, that we should return to. And then one other thing that I think that actually frames up some of the deep political considerations that also then relates to the deep psychology that we referenced in our last recording in terms of where at least I'm assessing Naomi Klein's intellectual limits or failures here, are not just in terms of deep politics, but are actually in terms of deep psychology and how those two areas intersect. Because what we noticed also is that when you go look at the Naomi Wolf's maybe most public and largest, largely distributed comments about the Israel lobby and Israel Palestine were at, I believe, the Oxford Union, and she's asked a question about how to negotiate how to tell the difference between anti-Semitism and criticism of Zionism or Israel or those kinds of things. And so she tries to give her take on it about that I'll just tell you that when people engage in what to me feels like an attack against all Jewish people that I consider anti-Semitic, that I have like an activation in my hindbrain. And she sort of really describes, I think, almost like a Tanakian, like she goes straight to this Old Testament, thousands of years old sort of Jewish hindbrained response or reaction where she's like, oh, in that case, just wipe them out. Basically, I think she says, but we'll include the link so people can sort of see exactly the way that she says it. But you can begin to like understand what's sort of operating right underneath the surface here in terms of the deep politics and the deep political dynamics and how it intersects with deep psychology in terms of these questions of anti-Semitism and free speech, right? Which is the big deal in terms of Elon Musk and X with what some people are calling the Sanhedrin, but I think that we would more properly call it the global neo-Parushim, tying it directly into an organized global society, the Parushim being a secret society. In this case, we're in the sort of overt neo-Parushim operation that is almost totally politically focused on the Zionist project, right? And that's what the Parushim was. They were pre-Israel, a pre-Israel network of influential people, Jews, influential Jewish people in different places of power, including heavily in the United States, who were operating on behalf of the rising Zionist political project. And so that's where you have the questions of Woodrow Wilson and World War I and Untermeyer and then how does Woodrow Wilson, this this white supremacist racist name the first, I think he's the first, Brandeis is the first Jewish Supreme Court justice.
Yes.
And so then you have Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter as these crucial members of the Parushim who are operating at the highest levels of the judiciary branch of the U.S. government and who are key players in this Parushim network. And by the way, remember, this is the Parushim that actually is uncovered by a Jewish, is well documented by like a Jewish New York Times writer and editor, and then an Israeli academic historian, and then is then highlighted by Alison Weir in her book Against Our Better Judgment, that then someone like Max Blumenthal calls basically anti-Semitic tropes, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about this secret Zionist society. Yeah, a secret Zionist society called the Parushim. And now we have this neo-Parushim, and there's a whole new, political contemporary format where the way that this is now being handled by the hashtag ban the ADL people who turned a lot of this into serving and servicing what we see as the second pillar of the quote unquote great global wars of the 21st century, of the global war on terror and now the global culture wars. And they are basically servicing this. And I've been, pointing this out, that this is They're setting it up as, the quote unquote liberal ADL, who then have like black cube agents come into their ban the ADL spaces to try to, propagandize against banning the ADL and interrupting their spaces in certain ways, versus the Elon Musk ex Prime Minister Netanyahu types. And all of this basically just played out in the last few weeks, as we've already talked about, of the Elon and Netanyahu having their sit down, and then this then turning into now Elon's very public meeting on the platform that he controls, X, with the global neo Parushim. And over again, this is really about politics. This is about deep politics. This is about core politics. The culture war is at best window dressing, but really at worst, and very likely more truthfully, is actually just part of the greasing of the skids for this deep political project. That the culture war is in service, is grist for the mill of this larger global deep political power project. And so that's I just wanted to point out that there, even Naomi Wolf, when she's at the height of her public skepticism about the Israel lobby and Israel Palestine, expresses almost in an almost like a sort of a very honest and unguarded kind of fashion about how her Old Testament Jewish hindbrain kicks in when she hears people talking about the Jews or something like that, or conflating the issues, right, of Zionism with the Jews, or in a way that makes her feel threatened as a Jewish person, rather than the organized Jewish power or the Israel lobby or that kind of thing. And that what comes up in her is a sense of, well, maybe we shouldn't even be having these conversations. Wipe them out. We should smite the Amalek, or something like that is what you begin to sort of hear being expressed there. And so this is why I continue to think that we have to deal with the actual deep politics of this matter and what is actually being done. And then the one last thing I wanted to point out before we get into the details and the structure of what the conversation that happened on X yesterday with Elon Musk hosting with help from Daily Wire. Very interesting, right? That you could go back to the Sinews of War video on the background of the dark history of Ben Shapiro in terms of the actual backers of the rise of Daily Wire, and especially in terms of in terms of a foreign aspect, coming in relationship with the Wilkes brothers, Chinese and Israeli. Like that's very much what we've seen in terms of what Shapiro's doing. And so Shapiro is like the Daily Wire is the one hosting the conversation for Elon Musk on his own platform. So Elon Musk can then talk to the global neo-Parushim of many different types, but all in service, I think, of just a couple main agenda points, really. So I just wanted to bring that up and then remind folks that I think it's actually, maybe it's gone into effect, but the date was supposed to be September 29th. That's today. So I don't know. We should check in to see what the deal is. But a company, I think it's Autotic, it's AU10 Tick, like authentic, this subsidiary of a key 9/11 security, quote unquote, breakdown company, ICTS, started by Shin Bet members tied into Israeli military intelligence, who were running, quote unquote, the airplane security for key parts of the 9/11 airplane operation, it looks like. And then also even the underwear bomber operation out of Europe, out of the Netherlands, I think, out of Schiphol Airport. I think that's where that was. And then, of course, the 9/11 cover up in terms of the U.S. judiciary in Southern District, New York, is there's again a connection to ICTS, which is the judge Alvin Hellerstein and his son. And the Hellerstein family, by the way, is very they are early Zionist power, and there's a lot of key Hellerstein players in Israel, and one of them, it looks like, in a legal fashion, is the judge on the 9/11 cases for the 9/11 family members. Alvin Hellerstein's son worked for a law firm that represented ICTS, which ultimately Hellerstein then released from the case, and thus preventing any serious inquiry and discovery into ICTS. A clear conflict of interest in terms of his family's relation there, and so this was I was pointing out that if these ban the ADL people were serious political people and actual thought leaders, they'd at least be bringing along this actionable issue. Besides sort of their wet dream of Elon Musk is going to sue the ADL for defamation for billions of dollars. Yeah, that's not happening, I don't think. That they could bring up, oh yeah, there's this 9/11 security breakdown suspect company tied into the commanding heights of the Israeli security state, ICTS, whose subsidiary Elon Musk is about to put our X identity biometrics data in the hands of. And remember the actual reason, the spoken reason for the big meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Elon Musk was the future of AI. And it's quite overt now that one of the big reasons in a long-term business capacity that Elon Musk was so interested in X and developing this idea of an everything app related to the Chinese app that everyone uses for everything, as Elon Musk says we need something like that for the West, is that it's a big data scraping operation for his approach to AI, right? And so Elon and Netanyahu were getting together over AI, the future of AI. And it is very likely that this indicates exactly what Elon Musk's intent is in terms of X, his relationship with the Israeli security state and the neo-Parushim, and especially Netanyahu, and willing to hand all of the biometric identity data, I guess eventually, starting, it was announced to begin today. And I think what they intend to do is they want to start having their users supply government documents, driver's licenses that are then going to be fed right into this authentic ICTS subsidiary in Israeli intelligence to run the identity protocol on X. So this is the real and deep political and technocratic intent of someone like Elon Musk, and why this is actually going down like this. And to my understanding, now maybe there was maybe almost a 10-hour response space by like the core of the hashtag ban the ADL people that happened yesterday after the Musk space. And maybe they touched on ICTS and the biometrics, but I'm still not familiar with any response or anything, either vocally or written, in terms of the question of this ICTS by any of that quote unquote thought leadership crew.
Well, they seem about as silent. They seem to have about as much to say on it as they do about their other favorite social media platform, their favorite video sharing website, Rumble, and its connections and what Rumble actually comes down to. So it seems that ICTS might be getting the Rumble treatment.
That's a very good point, because right in the middle of their quote unquote response space, they did highlight, and for an interesting reason, actually, because Elon Musk, in his conversation with the Parushim, was talking about Russell Brand and about why he was not going to remove Russell Brand, and sort of, and in terms of the allegations, in a similar kind of way where Rumble has stood up, to the British government around Russell Brand, and so then that was brought in by these ban the ADL spacers who were, highlighting how Rumble is a free speech platform, and as you pointed out, Greg, they still continue to avoid the fact that Rumble is basically an arm of Howard Lutnick, SPAC, right? At the epicenter of 9/11 questions around the World Trade Center, Cantor Fitzgerald. It's basically Cantor Fitzgerald, Howard Lutnick, next door neighbor to Epstein operation going on at Rumble, right? So all roads to Putin. All roads to Putin. Did Pelosi say? Yeah, it's certain roads. Yeah, most of the roads to Putin seem to sort of go through the Prime Minister's office in Israel. But in this case, in terms of like alt media, whether it's like Naomi Klein discussing with the Douglas Rushkoff, or the old Naomi Wolf, or the new Naomi Wolf, or if it's Rumble, or if it's Elon's ex. All roads seem to run to Epstein Maxwell, actually.
As an important interconnector of these various varying multinational interests. And and so and it seemed to me that the room we were in, this is kind of tangential, but it seems the room we were in where seemed to be more concerned about bringing in Laura Loomer to celebrate Trump than in trying to get to the bottom of any of this stuff. So yeah, I digress. So
and so this space yesterday with Elon Musk, it was outrageous, actually, the way that it all went down, including the framing by Ben Shapiro. It was clear Ben Shapiro was nervous. And then Elon Musk, even early on, again, he went and tried to do his sort of, dancing Israeli thing with his, he's got a mean Hava Nagila, and he went even deeper in terms of what he'd shared with his conversation with Netanyahu about his early years at a Hebrew school. And he said, I don't believe that I'm Jewish, but I don't know. But he called himself aspirationally Jewish, which Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, key player, obviously, in a lot of this, from the RFK Jr. debacle around who actually murdered his father, question, to the Tulsi Gabbard operation. Shmuley Boteach, right, was there celebrating Elon Musk, talking about being aspirationally Jewish. Wait, what did you say?
Oh, Shmuley debated a few years back Brett Stevens, now at the New York Times, formerly Wall Street Journal and Jerusalem Post. Is Trump good for the Jews? And he took the side of Trump being good. So
yes, and but Shapiro was a little bit wincing in terms of Elon Musk calling himself aspirationally Jewish, and he did a little bit of sort of Jewish self-demeaning a little bit about that's not all, that's not great, that's that's a difficult thing to be aspirationally Jewish or something like that. And Shmuley Boteach connected with Elon as that being the greatest compliment he'd ever heard to the Jewish people. And then they also connected over having lots of children. And Shmuley Boteach was saying that Elon Musk was a great man for encouraging people to have many children. And I think they both have had around 10 children, and they communed over that. So it was interesting. So that was then played into aspects of the framing of the culture war and population and all of that.
I think little things like that remind us that as much as and we lose light of this. I lose light of this sometimes too. But something that we try to go back to and keep in mind with this is that at the end of the day, with all of the with all of the nefarious agendas involved, that like there's still human beings at the end of the day, and even in circles like this, there's still real human dynamics at play. And I think we lose sight of that sometimes. And this is just another example of that.
It's true, and it is interesting that Leah McGrath, who is on Twitter and a public interest involved analyst and activist, who has publicly talked about being on the the autistic spectrum, said that she did not really understand how on the spectrum Elon Musk was until she heard this conversation. And actually, I understood what she was talking about, especially when Elon Musk was talking with the representative of the European Jewish Agency, I think it may be called, who was really the one who was really trying to hammer home the international Holocaust remembrance definition of anti-Semitism, which is really the Zion. This is the neo-Parushim goal here around speech, is to conflate anti-Semitism, where it's really traditionally been understood in a way that Naomi Wolf was prickling against in a Tanakian way at the Oxford Union, with just the pure power state, security state politics of the question of a Jewish state and the practices of the Jewish state and the founding of the Jewish state and the global deep political machinations to even create the Jewish state, or even what was for many years and even like a recognized debate within organized Jewish circles over Zionism and a Jewish state. Even we were just reading into the earlier years of the Jewish Agency and how non-Zionist Jews had to be given a seat at the table because the political Zionists knew that and this is especially, I think, like a Max Nordau type, believed that the Zionist movement had to at least look democratic, and so had to give even those in the Jewish community who had people like Albert Einstein, who didn't believe that that the way to approach it was an actual Jewish state, especially as they begin to see the formation of these terrorist brigades and the emphasis on ethnic cleansing and terrorism and all of that kind of thing. So there's an attempt to even erase that aspect of like fairly recent Jewish history, in terms of, yes, there's an actual legitimate debate over the question of Zionism in relationship to a Jewish state, even within organized Jewish circles. That is really the main payoff in terms of, I think, policy-wise, what they were after, in terms of this neo-Parushim conversation with Elon Musk. And when Elon Musk was speaking with this head of the European Jewish Association, who also then was like pushing Elon to come to Auschwitz with a bunch of European leaders, and he started out by trying to speak to Elon about knowledge, about sort of like what you can sort of really know the depth of the tragedy of what they call the Holocaust. I don't use that language. That language was introduced well after all of the tragedies that happened and the mass murder that happened during World War II. I call it Shoah. If you're talking about like the specific Jewish tragedy and the targeting and mass murder of Jews, then you call it the Shoah. The Holocaust is some kind of language that was introduced well after the fact, that has very strange sort of spiritualist and occultic even attempts at calling it a sacrifice, a burnt offering of some sort. And I reject that entire rhetorical domain. But that's the domain that they use, obviously. And so in inviting Elon Musk to Auschwitz with these other leaders, the leader of the European Jewish Agency, pushing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, appealed to Elon Musk, direct knowledge of like the dangers of rising anti-Semitic speech in relationship to the tragedies of the Shoah. I'm gonna call it the Shoah. And And Elon Musk was like, well, I'm very aware of history. I take history seriously. I've read all about it. I know all about it. I'm totally aware of some of the things that happened. And so the guy from the European Jewish Agency didn't get very far with Elon. It was actually, Elon was bristling against it, almost like the guy was trying to imply that Elon is doesn't know anything or doesn't know enough. And that's why he's, quote unquote, allowing the anti-Semitic speech on X or something like that. But once the guy, he changed it to, no, it's about feeling it. And now that was an interesting point, because there is an aspect, like people who have, maybe deeply emotional bodies. There is an aspect of when you go to a place, let's say, there are these these very human resonances that go beyond sort of knowing history. And I think there's positives and negatives to that too. Like I'm familiar with how that operates in terms of, Ground Zero, World Trade Center, 9/11, having visited the site and got into arguments with the, student scholars for 9/11 Truth, Justin Martell on 9/11 Blogger back in the days, who was trying to say that people who hadn't been to the Ground Zero on the date of 9/11 didn't have standing or something like that to make serious strategic claims or recommendations in terms of 9/11 Truth and Justice. And I was pointing out, you do not want to become a cult of geography or time and place. That's one of the things that we've emphasized here in terms of, calling something 11/9 or 9/11. We're trying to highlight how these are an attempt to take places and days out of an actual historical living fabric by turning it into almost a sacred site of time and space in many ways. And so you can get into these cults of geography and calendar. I think that part of the reason why we continue to insist on this question of 11/9 is to highlight the way that these kinds of weaponized cults of time and space are actually constructed, and that we want to free them from those cult mind states and those mind control mind states, and actually reestablish them inside of the fabric of living human history that continues onwards. And so, I understood that was a pretty good pitch to Elon. But Elon had no need for that, because I think partially because Elon really is on the spectrum, that he actually does, by reading about something, by seeing pictures or knowing about something, is really at the depth of like the way that he can feel into something, and that he had no interest in this idea of going to a place to feel it. But then the third try was the more successful try, was appealing to Elon's sense of self-importance. Okay, said the leader of the European Jewish Agency, or whatever it's called, about the Shoah, but others do not. Maybe you would be willing to join us to go to Auschwitz in order to be a thought leader, to show other people the way. And now Elon's like, yes, if it's just for that, to show leadership and to help others because I'm an important person. That's what was sort of unsaid and all of that. Then he said, okay, I will deeply consider it. On the other hand, no matter how much these ban the ADL people want to continue to like live with their heads in the sand about their attempted freeing of their new social media emperor, Elon Musk, they believe that he was being sort of like shaken down or pushed or something like that by these neo-Parushim. But when it really came down to it, I think it was also this European Jewish Agency leader said that we'd sent a letter to you, Elon, 100 Jewish leaders, about how we want you to adopt the IHRA I think he just called it the IRA. I think he kept on forgetting H, but the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which again is crucial because it's about deep politics. It's about conflating the question of the state power, the entire Zionist political enterprise and all of its history and deep political history with the question of what's also then titled anti-Semitism. By the way, I rejected that term too. That's a term that has been intensely cultivated by Deborah Lipstadt. She's insistent that it not have a hyphen in it, that it's a one word, and that way it relates back to the origins of it, which is in a German anti-Semite who defined the term as such. And of course, Deborah Lipstadt's quote unquote intellectual lineage runs not only through her patron Les Wexner, but also to Natan Sharansky, the sort of the 21st century godfather of the new anti-Semitism, who was also on the Neo-Parushim call, of course, during which something very interesting happened. But what actually happened is Elon Musk responded to the head of the European Jewish Agency and said, well, I wasn't familiar about this letter, but sure, I'll sign on to it. And I think he had already said that he actually considers anti-Zionism or anti-Israel views to be the highest form of anti-Semitism. That was, no one asked him, he was not cudgeled into saying that. That's what he believes. And Greg, you and I began to have conversations about, again, going back to, people's personal history and psychology playing a role in that, and Elon Musk's background in apartheid South Africa. And that not being a coincidence that the Israeli state worked deeply with the apartheid South African state, most obvious in the figure of Arnon Milchan and the weapons programs, both nuclear, biological, even ethno-specific weapons programs, Project Coast, I think it was called, right, in South Africa, that the Israelis maybe even appeared to take over that program, but they definitely work together. And so there's something about this, about, the sort of ethno-colonial project, and, not to use left terms, but yes, the ethno-colonial project, such as apartheid South Africa, and then the Zionist project of the Jewish state in Israel, led by, the Jews of Eurasia, really, in terms of most of the power positions and of the actual political project itself, that Elon Musk seems to really resonate with.
It seems that way, and I considered that when Musk mentioned he mentioned anti-Americanism and the attempts to erase Christopher Columbus. Well, and I'm not going to try to do a South African accent because I can't do it, but you try to erase Christopher Columbus, and but without Columbus, you don't have America. Which, well, I don't know if that's actually the case, but it's interesting that he made this.
Actually, Greg, in all reality, if you erase Amerigo Vespucci, you literally don't have America.
Well, there you go. But he linked it to Columbus, which is it's a part of the culture war, like the whole idea of Columbus being erased and all this, and it being an attack on Europeans and all of this, and I noticed Musk bring that in, and it made me think that there might be some resonance with potentially Musk, he comes from, I would say, people who were pretty well off in South African society in the apartheid age, and that there might be a resonance between Israel, South Africa, and even the United States, because as we've talked about, and this is something I think the ADL people would have a hard time with, because in their idea, everything the Europeans are always being made to feel guilty about themselves. But I digress. But there is this element that's kind of deep rooted within our cultures of the idea of finding the land and making something out of it. And I don't know if this is exactly what Elon's thinking of, but I was just thinking that there's a similarity with the Jews European Jews come into Palestine and make something out of the land. The British come into South Africa and make something out of the land. There's also Dutch that come into, but they end up clashing with each other and fighting wars in South Africa. And then, the U.S., the Europeans come into the U.S. and make something out of the land. So there is this, maybe it's something that's deep rooted. I'm not sure, but I thought of the possibility of that with Musk being from like a pretty well-off South African family, that there might be there could very well be a resonance between like this Zionism and even some type of yearning for maybe the way things were in South Africa once upon a time. I also thought it was interesting when Natan Sharansky mentioned the Durban conference, which was just, I think, within 2 to 3 weeks before September 11th, and potentially, I was even thinking of like a symbology of like the Durban conference, which was very critical of Zionism just before September 11th being in South Africa. So just something I thought about, and I think that there might be some resonance between this and Musk, maybe even some feelings about his own homeland, potentially.
Definitely, and in a way that not only plays into the terror war and the technology relationship that Musk obviously has with the Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli security state, but other security states around the world, obviously, but also then the culture war, this other twin pillar of these 21st century globally destructive and destabilizing, I'd say, synthetic and manufactured wars that are really destabilizing the body politics all around the world, and turning us, internally against each other in a way that's not an actual productive conversation about differences. So Elon Musk, he plays into that. By the way, what else did he do in highlighting the X technology of being able to live stream on X later that day is go down to the southern border and showcase the power of live streaming on X to show the real situation
Yes.
at the border. And I believe he wore his cowboy hat and his aviator glasses. I think he wore his cowboy hat backwards, but that's whatever.
Yeah, Musk is playing a major role in this narrative about the border that's going on. And then one more thing relates to the culture wars. I think Musk at some point positively cited Chaya Ralchik, libs of TikTok account. So
Chaya Raichik, yes.
Chaya Raichik, yeah.
Who
So
was
that
one
was
of one of the two base Jews that Lucas Gage from the band the ADL group were highlighting, were Chaya Raichik and Laura Loomer, the base Jews on our side to ban the ADL.
Gosh, yes. And Laura Loomer turned that ADL space into a Trump love fest, and they all agree with that, including Ryan Dawson. So
Yeah, that's true. Ryan Dawson kept on yelling out "based," but because of her support for Trump and attacking the pseudonym Max Nordau, who appears to be at the epicenter of the DeSantis operation.
yeah.
But yeah, and so this question of Sharansky, I think, is crucial in terms of yesterday's space. And you mentioned that he early on, when he finally got into like real politics, he brought in the Durban conference. But before that, and by the way, I don't know if I ever completed the thought, but one of the reasons that Ben Shapiro was originally appeared uncomfortable, more uncomfortable than Netanyahu was, who appeared to be, all right, okay, Elon, you want to like dance for the Israelis, sing and do a song and dance for the Israelis? We can roll out your Hava Nagila. Elon Musk once again talked about rolling out his Hava Nagila for Ben Shapiro, who was even more uncomfortable about that than Elon Musk proclaiming to be aspirationally Jewish. And by the way, Elon Musk also talked about how he was brought to Israel when he was 13 by his father. All right. South Africa and Israel. There we go. And so really, I don't think Elon Musk is aspirationally Jewish. I think he's aspirationally Israeli, and Zionist is really what's going on here. Obviously, he's aspirationally Parushim, neo-Parushim is what's actually going on here. And so, go for it, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say, there are aspects of what you might, this whole artificial split between the alt-right and the alt-light. There are elements of what you call the alt-light. And even this does sink into the alt-right somewhat, but that really do you'll see this expressed on times on places like Breitbart and other places, and then maybe even a little further than that. But the idea of like America should be more like Israel in terms of like, we should have gun rights. Like, they fancy for have gun, or I guess a citizen maybe with the whole idea of like protecting yourselves with these weapons the way that their perception of like the idea of the way Israelis do, or we should have immigration like Israelis. We should be able to build walls to keep people out. So there is this yearning of an element of like the American population. It's just, that does see like Israel as a model for what America can be. So it's interesting to point out aspirationally Israeli, because I think that is something that appeals to a number of people.
Yeah, the solution for school shootings in the United States is more, like military types with guns at schools, like they do in Israel. Like, right, you're right, Greg. So there is very much the culture war resonance, I think, with Elon Musk hooking up this alt-right, alt-light, neo-Parushim overseen culture war aspect into once again into the question of Israel as the model in many ways.
And what unites, one of the things that unites, right wing Israeli Zionist right wingers, Russians, and people like Viktor Orban, as well as Americans and one thing that unites multiple groups of people like are this they're in opposition to George Soros and NGO organizations of that ilk, are common resistance to less stringent immigration policies. And that's one thing that all of these people either embrace it, like the stupid Andrew Meyer, Amschel Anglin, Daily Stormer types, or they deny it, or they just don't act like it's not a reality, that like the Israelis, the Netanyahu government, and they are very much against, they share a common opposition to Soros, NGO types that is shared by the Western world, is also shared by Hungarians and Russians on things from immigration to quote unquote human rights, etc. Like these are things that bring like these entities together that a lot of people are still like that I don't think are willing to acknowledge.
Definitely. And maybe we can finish up, Greg, by just fleshing out maybe two of I think the key speakers of the Neo-Parushim element, which were, I believe, Natan Sharansky and Alan Dershowitz. Now, Alan Dershowitz actually appeared to present the most intellectually coherent proposal around the question of free speech and X. Now, there are a lot of assumptions and obviously a weaponized investment that Dershowitz has to these actual Neo-Parushim power networks that were unspoken in terms of the problematic aspect of Dershowitz's proposal, which was to stop talking about lines, about where is the line of anti-Semitic speech or something like that, to talk about circles, a circle where inside the circle is any speech, no matter how hateful. And Dershowitz said this thing about how one person's hate speech is another person's love speech or something like that. And that activates a bunch of people. And then he basically said that that all non-illegal speech has to be allowed inside of the circle of conversation. Now, of course, one part of that's not talked about, as we talked about yesterday, Greg, is he's actually not talking about, he's really talking about who's at the center of the circle. And so certain kinds of speech will be allowed in the circle, but sort of in line with Elon Musk's, freedom of speech, not freedom of reach kind of thing, and the algorithms to what he says to emphasize loving speech or positive speech over negative speech or hateful speech is really defining then what the nature of these political powers the way they'd like to network a circle, a Dershowitz circle, inclusive core political speech in terms of all legal speech, no matter how disturbing or hateful, should be allowed, and that kind of thing. No matter this, the background of Dershowitz, obviously very, very problematic to say the least, or the nature of the actual networks of power that he's serving in terms of this. It had to be seen that there was some type of legitimate intellectual coherence in terms of his proposal. Now, the flip side of that was Natan Sharansky, who was the biggest obvious hypocrite, total intellectual incoherence in terms of what he was actually presenting. So maybe we could just quickly go over those two guys a little bit more.
Yeah, let's do that. And I guess I'll say I guess what I noticed with Dershowitz was interesting. What you said, like, yeah, this is really rational sounding, like the way he's going about this, and that is, I think and I had talked to you about this yesterday on that. His idea of free speech, and I guess the way Dershowitz would go about things is if you do something that he thinks is incorrect or wrong, like he'll publicly take to the to the airwaves or to the written word to tell you why you're wrong about it. And that's not violation of free speech. That's true. That would be in coordination with that. Like he's just correcting the record is how you put it, I think, or some variation of that. But also, on the flip side of that, I would say that Alan Dershowitz, he's the free speech guy. He'll defend anybody no matter how controversial they are. I think that is his justification for defending the Skokie quote unquote Nazi or Matthew. Oh God, the guy's name is escaping me.
Matthew Hale.
Matthew Hale. Yes, who Glenn Greenwald also later defended. But he'll defend the most controversial clients. Israel is his toughest client, as he says. But in the at the same time, Dershowitz fully, I think, understands like the power. And that on one hand, okay, yeah, I'll defend your free speech, but also he understands like the power and the ability of like organizations and entities that he's connected to have in terms of actually some of the methods they can take to counter speech. And so, maybe things like ultimately with the end result of things like what happened to you at the Kansas City Library, Dershowitz, the free speech lawyer, still, I think, has an understanding of like the pressure that's going to be brought upon people in multiple ways that go beyond just Alan Dershowitz writing an op-ed or emailing a board of trustees of a university about your work.
Yes. And of course, the phrase, so there's two main conceptual geometries of some sort that Dershowitz used to lay out his proposal for Elon Musk. And Elon Musk had said that he believed that there was a ton of overlap in their beliefs. And by the way, one of the things that Dershowitz seemed to be doing was trying to actually run PR for Elon by saying you have to at least not be perceived. And he said, hopefully, actually not actually moving the platform with a right-wing perspective or something like that. And Elon was saying, going back to Einstein again, Elon brought up Einstein many times, about how everything is relative. And so if Twitter had gotten too left during the previous administration of Twitter, then anything moving back to the center, of course, they kept talking about the center. No one said the middle. Again, that's why the radical middle. It's a radical concept, the radical middle. They kept on talking about moving it back to the center. Elon Musk was like that if it's gone too far to the left, then it will inherently be perceived that you're moving right because you are moving right, to get back to the center. All right, so that was one thing that Dershowitz was trying to coach Elon on, the perception management around this is going to fail. Your project here at Elon, Dershowitz was making it seem like Elon Musk was the first person in all of history that was actually going to create a real free speech platform or something like that. Alan, we've had these platforms before. They're called sidewalks, parks. the post office, public libraries, and public events. These kinds of things. We've had these kinds of scenarios, and rather than the Elon Musk's attempt to create some sort of CCP style everything app.
Was Dershowitz positively citing Elon Musk in contrast to like even like the Washingtons and the Jeffersons in terms of like his commitment to like an actual true like marketplace?
Elon, where Thomas Jefferson and Madison failed,
Yeah, Jefferson
you
and
will
Madison,
succeed. I want you to succeed, but you can't be perceived as working from the right or working with the right or something like that. And so that was like the I think that was the what if the guy from the European Jewish Agency was really trying to seal the deal on the IHRA definition, which Elon Musk was already there well before him. Elon Musk was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Dershowitz's job was to run the PR operation in terms of perception management. But back to the two geometrical analogs that Dershowitz was using. One was this circle. The other was, as you pointed out, Greg, is related to the idea of the marketplace of ideas, right? And so this is actually an area where someone like Naomi Klein and her shock doctrine, left critique of disaster capitalism and the Chicago School and all of that would actually become in very helpful, because there's all of this, unspoken power dynamics and money dynamics that are built into even the concept, of course, of the marketplace of ideas, right? Because it's not really, one would think, okay, it's actually talking about some kind of town square where everybody can, put out their wares. But what they're really talking about is a mall or a street with storefronts where you can market your idea. And so the question of who owns the property, whether it's digital or physical, or the presses or the servers, or then who also owns the means of communication, whether it's advertising, signage, or digital advertising and network traffic and all of that, is totally, not interrogated in terms of the proposal of a marketplace of ideas. And so those were the Dershowitz's key contributions in an intellectual fashion that have deeply problematic, unquestioned assumptions behind them that were really in service of his running, a lawyer as a PR advisor to Elon in this public square.
And I think in the process of that, you could see part of why Dershowitz would have like had, appeal within, respectable, liberal, respectable circles for so long before Trump, and he was persecuted by being shut out of social gatherings at Martha's Vineyard because he dared defend Trump's right to be president or something. You can see why that this would be, at least on the surface level, would be attractive, and having this reputation as like this true free speech warrior, a civil libertarian, as he calls himself. Like, you can see it. And it is, when you compare it to like the way some of these other people were talking, like, Sharansky and others, like, yeah, I can see why this would, on surface level be, sound very appealing. So I got that. I could get that listening to Dershowitz and the way you classified it, as far as being, the rational sounding person on the stage, as far as these matters go. I can see that more and more, like how that is appealing in some circles.
Well, that's a good point that then makes me think about how then there's this other part of Dershowitz's circle analogy proposal, where there's a deep problem and uninterrogated issue, not just with the question of who's in the center of the circle and who's holding these sort of fringe, ideas at bay in terms of the marketplace of idea, but it's also the question of then defining what's outside of the circle, where you just pointed out that Dershowitz has a very recent, very, I would say, questionably criminal role in terms of, misprision of seditious conspiracy, in terms of trying to redefine what more and more the facts point to, that, January 6th, the entire run up and the wake of the 2020 election and all of the Trump operators were really involved in seditious conspiracy. And Dershowitz was a key leading voice to try to say, no, 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 that's not outside of the circle of core political speech. That is core political speech. And they're trying to turn this into seditious conspiracy, which is clearly outside of the circle. So Dershowitz's proposal is problematic in his own persona, in his own character, in his own public work, let's say, by both, questions of who's on the inside of the circle in terms of Dershowitz's network, but also then who's then allowed to stay in the circle while also being involved in prima facie seditious conspiracy.
Yeah. Right, and that's interesting. And that's where I think there's the glorification of the. And I don't know. I'm not the person to talk about this. It's probably been part of the Dershowitz and the celebrity client culture. Probably part of that is there's an element of this that normalizes criminal activity or behavior in the name of free speech and I mean that's an area that's a little out of my realm. But just thinking about that as you mentioned that I think somebody like a Dershowitz would be a figure with some of his celebrity cases of this glorification of this idea of just the ultimate free speech broker, really in the name of just shielding heinous things under free speech. There's a part of it that's a play with that, and even a glorification through celebrity culture and celebrity attorneys and all this. So anyway.
Okay, so let's just finish up by talking a little bit about Natan Sharansky. And by the way, we've just now begun to dig deeper, and I'll credit you, Greg. You were always focused on Ron Dermer, and you would keep pointing out to me through my thick skull. They would not quite resonate with me in the same way that Michael Ledeen, being Michael Flynn's co-author of The Field of Fight during the 2016 election season, that you kept pointing out to me that Natan Sharansky's co-author in his key post 9/11 book, The Case for Democracy or something like that, which was recognized, I think published in 2004 and recognized as highly influential in maybe the thinking, but definitely in the public relations and communications strategies of the George W. Bush White House, a White House at war, in Iraq, as a justification for what we probably should call the clean break wars and reshaping the Middle East and creating democratic forces that will then spread like a positive virus or something like that. And that Dermer, who, by the way, is called Netanyahu's brain, right? And it's, the kind of people that call Dugin Putin's brain, or Rove, right? Wasn't Rove called George Bush's brain, or, those kinds of things. The Dermer is recognized as Netanyahu's brain, and he's the co-author of Sharansky, who, by the way, the more and more I actually encounter Sharansky on these digital spaces, I've encountered him on these Zoom calls where I've tried to call into question his role in the architectures of the clean break wars, but also the question of these Israeli Jewish Soviet refuseniks, writing a book about him, unmasking him, I think was the title of the book, by respected Israeli surgeon Yuli Nudelman, that then Sharansky then sued over, and Nudelman actually had witnesses on his side who had actually been Soviet refuseniks and some of them had direct witness evidence. Now, I'm not sure if they witnessed it themselves or they knew the people who would witness it, in terms of Sharansky, when he was in a Soviet prison, appeared to actually be shacked up in the guardhouse. So calling into question whether Sharansky was actually a Soviet snitch rather than a political prisoner, and ultimately maybe some kind of Soviet police agent of some sort. So just in my encounter with Sharansky, in terms of his written work. He almost always has a co-author too. Even when he wrote the article about the un-Jews, the unjewing and this is mainly about the Zionism issue, Jews who don't, either non-Zionist, post-Zionist, anti-Zionist, they're not real Jews, right? So this whole weaponized IHRA definition is not just for the Gentiles. It's also to make sure to keep the un-Jews in line too, in terms of the definition of what it means to be a Jew. I've just found that Sharansky is sort of a dim. He's a dim bulb. There's not a lot going on there intellectually. Now I know he's smart in certain ways, like he's good at chess. He's good politically. I'm sure he's read some things, but in terms of actually like intellectual capacity, I don't see a lot there. And so that then began to make me think that, that you pointing out that Dermer is the co-author for this key book, and then Dermer being seen as what Frank Luntz, who was his professor at Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania, called his brightest student, Greg, or something like that?
I think that's what he referred to him as. Yeah, and by the way, Ron Dermer chose to go to University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School, after reading The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. That was right in his Wikipedia profile, as Dermer cited that at a reunion dinner as his reason for going to the Wharton Business School at Penn. So...
out of control. And of course, there's another one who seems to always have a co-author, right? The co-author of Art of the Deal by Donald Trump, Tony Schwartz, actually ended up whistleblowing on his ass, too. So this is a sort of interesting history here.
And in the book, I believe it was it in BB My Story where Benjamin Netanyahu, I think, I don't know, I think he mentioned Ron Dermer as, I think Dermer would help sell Trump on certain, policies as far as Israel Palestine goes by making golf analogies. Like if think of this as a 25-foot putt, or think of this. So it's just, and you could see that. But Dermer is a very interesting guy behind the shadows. I mean, he went to Penn and to Oxford, and he was a student of Frank Luntz's, and then he got involved in Israeli politics with Sharansky in late 90s, 96, which was the year Netanyahu became prime minister, and then was introduced to Benjamin Netanyahu via Sharansky, and he immediately becomes like this right-hand man of sorts to Netanyahu.
And it looks like he was introduced to Sharansky by this key and not very well-known, actually Oxford, it looks like, oriented power player. That we'll get into all of that later. And then one other thing we're looking at in terms of Dermer, and obviously his key role in terms of Natan Sharansky, the great mind of the new anti-Semitism and of the wars for democracy and all of that kind of stuff, is the actual family history there, the Dermers, right? And so they are Miami power players before Dermer became, relinquished his American citizenship and went to Israel, by the way, right as you were pointing out, just right in with Netanyahu. I think he comes in 1996 as Netanyahu's brought in by the Arthur Finkelstein network, of who Frank Luntz is a key Finky kid. And so does that mean Dermer is like a second generation Finky kid? It seems so, right? And that's how he's then. So there probably is a relationship even directly between Arthur Finkelstein, and Ron Dermer in terms of that 1996 bringing Netanyahu into power. But the background of the family, the Dermer family, seems to coincide with this question of mob activity. Miami, Florida, obviously. Meyer Lansky, where does Meyer Lansky end up after actually multiple countries around the world would not take his $1 million in exchange for giving him asylum of some sort? Even the Israelis were a little bit uncomfortable around Sharansky. Meyer Lansky. And so Meyer Lansky ends up in Miami while the Dermers move down from New York City sometime, I think, in the 60s. And then the father of Ron Dermer, Jay Dermer, becomes the mayor of Miami. And by the way, Ron Dermer helped his brother become a two-time mayor of Miami. And
Miami
so
Beach.
there are some questions here in terms of gambling, mob money, the Meyer Lansky syndicate, the Miami connection here in terms of the actual root of Ron Dermer.
Definitely. And it's interesting that in the early days of the Trump administration, it was David Friedman who got all the attention as the ambassador to Israel, like, this hard line settlement hawk, and Trump is putting somebody who's not going to be an honest, like, broker as far as the Middle East goes, as far as Israel Palestine goes. I think that was accurate, of course. I think pretty important and accurate person to focus on in that regard, and his own connections like the Trump organization and all this. But Ron Dermer very, very much flew under the radar, like in this crucial role as like this American-born, South Florida-born. Uh, ultimately gives up his American citizenship in order to serve in Israel and the Israeli government, and then is the ambassador to Israel's ambassador to the U.S. during the contentious final years of Obama on throughout the Trump administration, and he very much flew under the radar in comparison to other people who got far more attention than he did. But I think Dermer is a very just based on some of this and then other things as well. That we'll share in some, we'll post a couple articles. Dermer is a very important person, I think, to understand. And then one last thing I'll say about Dermer is that go back to the an article that we covered on air several years back, Trump's New World Order, written in the New Yorker by Adam Entis in 2018, and it was the scene was the inauguration of Trump, and someone pointed to Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, said, "You're the most important ambassador here today." Kislyak smiles and points at Ron Dermer and says, "No, he's the most important ambassador today."
Very good, Greg. I got to hand it to you for staying on the Dermer beat over all these years. Crucial character, and you're
I've
right.
just noticed he's around.
And he flew under the radar way more than he should have in terms of how crucial a player he is in terms of the timing of all this. He was crucial to Netanyahu's storming of the Capitol in 2015.
Yes.
The Netanyahu and Dermer even I think lay out as like this key moment in terms of what ultimately become the Abraham Accords. That the key mainly Emirati and Saudi leadership will reach out to Netanyahu after they see the way that he confronted Obama over the quote-unquote Iran threat and all of that. And as we pointed out before in terms of our analysis of the 11/9 operation and of Netanyahu's autobiography, that what's unsaid by Netanyahu, and now I would say add on Dermer, is that it was also the hatching of the logistics of the actual 11/9 operation to back and install Trump into the White House that very likely is launched after the storming of the Capitol by Netanyahu, that Dermer played a key role in terms of the communications over and the logistics and all of that. And then after that is when you then see the Red Sea yacht conspiracy that really is the launching of at the very least, of the Middle Eastern component of the 11/9 operation to install Trump, and I would say then create the entire political destabilizing, really political clean break program for the American body politic and beyond that we've seen since then. So Dermer, key figure, not only for Netanyahu but also for Sharansky. And so I just want to finish up by pointing out that Sharansky, the reason why I see Sharansky was was the most hypocritical and at least intellectually coherent of basically all of the voices of all of the neo-Parushim voices on X yesterday with Elon Musk, was because he comes in by saying, I am a Soviet dissident. I was a Soviet Jewish dissident, and I saw the way that they tried to restrict free speech of Jews and religious expression and all of that. So I understand free speech. But then he immediately transitions into, I also understand how the Soviet regime at the time was also had its own anti-Semitic propaganda that it was pushing, and so we need to figure out how to reckon with the idea that what I've seen is that most of the time, much of the time, people's anti-Zionism is really anti-Semitism. We need to put these protocols in place for people to be to understand that. So it's obviously intellectually coherent, because what I think he's really saying is that the elements of the U.S. civil society in this case, and the U.S. government really doesn't really have the freedom of speech that we all do, including government has freedom of speech, right? And in terms of questions around not operationalizing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Although it's been acknowledged, it's not been operationalized by the U.S. government recently. So there's something there where he's basically, equating the Soviet Union's, sort of Stalinist anti-Semitic propaganda with the, just sort of like, a little bit of, U.S. civil society and U.S. government pushback around Zionist control of our public policy and public discourse. And so there's something here where he immediately goes into how are we going to really sort of, police civil society speech around equating Zionism and anti-Semitism, and he's comparing it to to Soviet state propaganda of some sort. So there's just an incoherence. He's flipping. The logic does not hold at all. And I don't even think he cares about whether it holds. He moves so quickly. It's just a talking point that he's trying to establish his credentials, which is why I think it's very important to understand who Sharansky actually is in the background, and the questions of what I would call established Soviet Jewish Israeli dissidents who seem to have evidence against Sharansky being an actual authentic dissident rather than a long-term Soviet police snitch at the very least, and maybe something more like some kind of agent over time. And so, if Sharansky had his way, I'm sure he would have liked to have shut down Jewish American journalist of conscience, Robert Friedman, especially his book Red Mafia, that deals with Sharansky's ties to Russian organized crime and how that was brought in when Sharansky got into highest levels of Israeli politics, and how Sharansky teamed up with Netanyahu and brought on all this Russian organized crime money into their politics and all of that. So I'm sure Sharansky would have loved if he'd been able to shut down Robert Freeman's books. But what he was able to do was use the Israeli civil courts to really shut down his own Israeli, people who were already there in Israel before he became an Israeli citizen, who were calling out the actual background there of Sharansky. That was in the late '90s, I think. So Sharansky is a anti-free speech. He's definitely anti-core political free speech kind of character. But then he slipped immediately into the Durban conference, which, as we pointed out, Greg, when we did our analysis of the Daily Wire's trip to Jerusalem with Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, that the speaker who introduced the conversation was really honed in on the threat of the Durban conference. Right. So there's something very, very big there. As you pointed out, it's right. It's, there's a lot of talk of like the WTO protests. Of course, Naomi Klein being a crucial voice in terms of anti-globalization, especially from a left critical perspective in that way. But the other side of it, in terms of you're thinking more core political life, was the Durban conference, and obviously the question of Zionism and speech around Zionism being policed intensely, which is what they obviously wanted to do.
Yes,
And then
go ahead.
go for it.
No, go ahead. I'll make my point after you. Go ahead.
No, go. You go for it because I just want to talk about the last point about how Elon Musk during the conversation where Sharansky talked about elite high schools teaching how Mossad blew up the towers. And I'd like to finish on that.
Okay, no problem. I was just going to point out also the person, and we'll post links. The Peterson Netanyahu Shapiro thing in Jerusalem was also very, very vocal about the paleo neocons, as we call them, in the form of Francis Fukuyama giving up the culture war and going soft on what needed to be fought and on the front of like the winning the war globally based on culture and how they gave it up. So I want to throw that in there as well. That was another tenet of the of that whole thing in Jerusalem was the giving up by the Fukuyama paleo neocons of the global culture war.
Very important, Greg, because that just really shows what was all going on here, right? It's basically re-emphasized the culture war and operationalized the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And Elon Musk is down for both. He basically went for it during the space and then proved his credentials in terms of the culture war by immediately using X technology to highlight the threat from the border. Okay, later that day. But I would say the most politically interesting moment of the entire Elon Musk with the Neo-Parushim space was when Elon Musk, as we pointed out, he seemed to not really. I got the sense that Musk didn't respect Sharansky, and he sort of rolled over Sharansky, and Sharansky trying to make it all about anti-Zionism, and then that's when Elon Musk went into it. But what about anti-Americanism, and that's also being taught, and then Musk shifted into. He first called him a friend. No, he's not a friend, but I have an acquaintance who I know who's educated at the elite New York high schools, who's telling me all this anti-American stuff and that the Mossad blew up the towers on 9/11, this absurd kind of thing. So that was a very, very interesting moment, and Sharansky got freaked out. You could tell that conversation Sharansky tried to sort of shift it away immediately, but then sort of like immediately handed it over. And in the wake of that, it's interesting, our friend on Twitter, Chris Rulon, was making the point that a TrueAnon account was highlighting how Elon Musk was raving about this, and Chris has been pointing out how TrueAnon doesn't really go deep in terms of the question of Israeli intelligence and Epstein Maxwell and Israeli intelligence in 9/11. And he was trying to provoke them to have me on to deepen their understanding of quote unquote Mossad blew up the towers. And my response was that actually, I would go and try to correct these elite public high school. These elite high schools teaching this kind of thing, because the actual forensics and contextual evidence surrounding Ground Zero and the World Trade Center actually points to something more like elements of Israeli military intelligence rather than human Mossad organizing that aspect of the destruction of the World Trade Center as what I called the 21st century version on murderous steroids of the King David Hotel bombing that really was the sort of the big terrorist act that helped put the terrorist groups in power that ultimately became the Israeli security state.
I think there's a distinguishing. I think that's somewhat important because you can do like the more just crass new Nick Fuentes X account who was in the call last night. In that space last night, Israel did 9/11, or you could just go Mossad did 9/11. There's a difference there because when you say Israel did 9/11 or when you say Mossad did 9/11, I think because of the way that like these, I think Mossad is just associated with Israel. It's like, it's like saying the CIA did something as like, collectively. And I don't think there's any attempt to like distinguish collective from actual individual elements. Whereas if you say like, okay, well, this particular aspect of military intelligence was likely involved with this, likely at the epicenter of this, rather than just like a collective term like, Mossad or Israel, because then I think terms like that allow, and this is what a lot of people want, including like these new anti-Semitism pushers, I think, like there's an idea of people running around saying that 9/11 was a crime, like, oh, it was done by Israel or it was done by Mossad, because then you don't really make any types of distinguishments between individual elements or particular particular maybe intentions or goals of like a small specific groupings of people, and instead just like collectively, okay, well, it was Mossad, which equals Israel, which equals the Jews did it, so just collectively blame the entire group. So I think that there's distinguishments there that are important, like when certain groups did something, like Mossad did it or Israel did it, as opposed to, okay, well, let's actually look at like the who, what, and why, and like actually specifics of this. Instead, those blanket terms are thrown out. There's just another variation on like the they did it that has become so prevalent within conspiracy culture. They. In this case, they becomes Mossad, Israel, the Jews collectively. So I think that's something to think about as well.
Exactly. And that was sort of like one of my purposes in writing that in that way. I was sort of making a little bit of a joke, like Elon Musk immediately saying that's absurd, and basically me saying that, it's not absurd. It's just a little bit wrong. And let's actually they're wrong. They're wrong to teach that, but they're wrong because they don't actually have what's being described is not an actual deep political analysis, but quote unquote a conspiracy theory in the way that you're talking about how the way that it sort of it's turned away from facts and forensics and analysis in a journalistic who, what, when, where, why, how, or a means, motive, opportunity kind of thing, or the way that we've, begin to produce conceptual frameworks of military intelligence, counterintelligence for different parts of deep political operations. And so, yeah, it's a way of reestablishing that this is about deep political analysis that's based on facts and forensics, not quote unquote outrageous, absurd conspiracy theories that are being taught at these elite high schools or something like that. And so that was part of it. And I also think that it's also about like reestablishing the importance of deep political analysis and the way that we intend and want to do it, which is the idea of actually using facts and forensics and analysis to, say names and dates and places and infer motivations and use public documents and public media and books and stuff like that about where there actually is, names and dates and places and papers, the titles of papers or geostrategic interests that you can actually point to rather than say, quote unquote, Israel did 9/11 or Mossad blew up the towers or something like that. So it's a response to quote unquote both sides of that dynamic.
Yeah, I agree. So anything else before we wrap up here, Jeremy?
No, I don't think so. I'm not sure if is Elon Musk going to get a chance to prove that he's aspirationally Jewish by doing his mean Hava Nagila and doing a song and dance for his best Israeli friends, especially Prime Minister, credibly accused 9/11 mastermind suspect Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't know. He wants to do it. Someone should let him do it.
Well, at the very least, maybe you'll get to dance around with the Orthodox Jews the way Alex Jones did at the Capitol on Inauguration Eve 2017.
No one will let him sing or dance. I think he really just wants to sing or dance. It's like Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, being able to do his song and guitar as part of the global music diplomacy. So Elon Musk, as Netanyahu called him, the unofficial president of the United States, wants to be able to do his song and dance too.
Well,
someone should let him.
The Cornerstone Church in San Antonio, John Hagee's church, will invite him to do Hava Nagila, Texas style, maybe. He can wear his cowboy hat to Cornerstone Church when he goes down to the border.
That's a great idea. Get Bob Menendez, the doppelganger of Hagee. No. I guess Hagee's dead, right, Greg?
No, Hagee's alive. He's still doing his thing. His son kind of runs the day-to-day ministry, but he's still involved.
Oh, I feel like that's what Elon should do. Instead of going to the border with the X Live capacity, he should go do his Hava Nagila Texas barbecue style with the Hagies. That he could do that. He could pull that off. That's my proposal.
Or you could, do both. I don't know, but in any event, we'll see if this manifestation ever becomes reality of Elon Musk. And I'm sure it will go viral, as they say, if it ever happens. So.
All right. Well, we will return to the intellectual wake of all of this, but then we will then further dive back into Naomi Klein and her doppelganger mirror world and the problems of the missing deep politics component of all of that, and also the missing deep psychology aspect of all of that. Oh, and by the way, part of the thing that we didn't mention is that we're also then listening to a recent podcast on the Know Your Enemy podcast by the Jewish currents, maybe non-Zionist Jews, post-Zionist Jews, some maybe anti-Zionist Jews, and their analysis of the Ban the ADL campaign and then of the ADL. And just in a first listen, we hear them skipping over the question of what was the ADL doing during the 1960s. They also seem to erase actual, like some of the people who were crucial to exposing the ADL for spying on American civil society. People like Jeffrey Blankford, who were very early post-Zionist, maybe anti-Zionist Jews who started an actual alternative to the Zionist captured labor movement in the United States back in the 70s, and who then was maybe the prime mover as a target himself by the ADL spying efforts. And the Jewish current people seem to erase un-Jew or just unhuman, unperson Jews like Jeffrey Blankford in terms of both their conversation and their apparent understanding of the actual nature of deep politics in terms of the ADL. So that will be part of our ongoing conversation around these topics, in addition to Naomi Klein's doppelganger, deep state doppelgang-banging enter the vacuum world.
All right, sounds good. We'll be talking a lot about deep state doppelgangbangers and neo-Parushim going forward, I'm sure. So, neo-Parushim going forward. So look out for that. Jeremy, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.